Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name is, of course, Csaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Guild Wars 2 in 2022. And we've got a fair bit to talk about because there's been a lot of exciting news for Guild Wars 2 in the past month and a bit. Obviously, the expansion has released, End of Dragons. I've played it. I want to talk about it. This isn't going to be my full review of the expansion, as I do think there's a lot of things I haven't gotten to, as well as some content that's not been released, mainly the Strike Mission Challenge modes, which I think is a pretty important part of the overall expansion package. And then some additional news that ArenaNet has released in the past couple of weeks. That's one of the most exciting things, and probably what this title of this video is going to be about, that the fourth expansion has been confirmed, which is huge. If you go back through all of my content and look at the number one thing that I complain about when it comes to Guild Wars 2, it's a lack of consistency and predictability in terms of future content. The fact that the game in this post, we'll dive a bit deeper into this in just a second, but they're confirming a new expansion for Guild Wars 2. It's a ways out, right? We just had the third one. It's going to be a while, but it's going to happen. They've also confirmed that living story content is a very important part of the future of the game. So just that, saying that, we're doing expansions, we're doing living story content between the expansions, and you can count on that, is the biggest news that they could release. And I'm so excited about that. We're going to get into that, what it means for the future of the game, and some of the other details that they released during this blog post in just a second. But just before we jump into all of that, I should mention I am a Guild Wars 2 or ArenaNet partner. Does this mean I won't say anything bad about Guild Wars 2? No, as you'll see in the video, I have no trouble saying the bad, I have no trouble saying the good, but it does mean that you'll find 2 sponsored referral links in the description section below. One of them is to try out the game for free, the other is to buy any of the expansions, including the most recent End of Dragons expansion. Using either of those links does help out the channel, so if you're interested, please consider using them. If not, just ignore them, and let's dive into the video. Okay, so first and foremost, I want to talk about the actual expansion, because I haven't made a video about it. I've been wanting to make a video about it, and it's been really hard, because it's kind of hard to measure when you should start talking about an expansion for MMOs, because the content kind of pours out slowly, as opposed to just the game's there it is. But in terms of initial experiences, I think it's been one of my favorite expansion in terms of Guild Wars 2, but also in terms of all MMO expansions. It was easy. I had the expansion, I played it on day one without any issues. I dived in deeper a little bit later on stream, which was great, but you could access it right away, which was just so good, and it's not talked about enough because so many games have issues on launch day. And that's not to say that there were no issues whatsoever. I'm sure there were specific isolated issues for certain people, but overall, it was very stable and it played very well. There wasn't a ton of bugs that I ran into. There were, I'm sure, once again, bugs for certain people, but I had a completely excellent experience going through it. And let's talk about how we go through it. So it starts very much like a living story. You kind of get a message to go meet with our characters that are common to us, and we find out that we have to go and investigate some stuff that's happening. I'm going to be trying to be a bit vague, but I will get into some details at points. But essentially, we find ourselves in Cantha, and the way the story is delivered is probably one of the best versions of story delivery I've seen in any other game. Final Fantasy XIV might have a better story in terms of the content, and it probably does. But the way that Guild Wars 2 delivers its story, the way the dialogue is spoken, the way the voice acting is done, the way your character actually has voice acted lines that responds to everything is, I think, best in class for all MMOs. It's just so good. And I actually laughed out loud for certain conversations and certain interactions throughout the story, which, despite the fact that I'm quite engaged in certain other stories and MMOs, rarely does it make me actually laugh. Rarely that I'm like, haha, like it was so well done. And the story's big as well. Obviously, it's tying kind of the end to the Elder Dragon cycle, as they call it. So it's a pretty big deliverable. And I think on a lot of counts, it did pretty well. I think, like most Guild Wars 2 expansions, it has kind of a very slow start, and the middle gets really interesting, and then it does end a bit abruptly. And I don't know how you would really solve that without it feeling too long as well, because if it was the same pace as it was at the start the whole way through, it would get kind of tiresome. And if it was, short the whole way through, it wouldn't feel like an expansion. So it's a little challenging that way, but I'd say overall it felt really good. The moments at the end, like the absolute end fight and stuff like that, they feel big. They do feel impactful. You see a lot of the characters you have throughout the expansion, as well as additional characters that come in for the final fight, so it feels like everyone's there. There's an epilogue to it, which does feel like a nice bow on top, so it does feel concluded in that sense. I just feel like it was a very quick resolution. About like 3/4 the way through, it's like, okay, it's time for the big battle. Let's do this. And that kind of leads me to my first thing that I felt was very different about this expansion is that, much like Final Fantasy expansions, we had a subsection of our characters that were very prominent throughout this. And this has kind of happened in Living Story episodes and stuff like that, but it was interesting to see it happen for a full expansion, that there were characters that obviously had ties to Cantha and made sense to be in Cantha that were there. And I think because of that, obviously it's a benefit to ArenaNet because they don't have all of the voice actors for all of the stuff. But it allows them to focus deeper into these characters and kind of really see how they interact with people. And I thought it was really well done. I think it just really brought a lot of characters to light that otherwise were still feeling kind of fresh or didn't have screen time in a long time. So I hope they continue doing that for other expansions and that we get to see them focus in on different characters and really tell their stories. The last real piece that I want to talk about for the expansion is the actual gameplay. So I tried the Virtuoso for the Mesmer, had a lot of fun with it. I think it was a big success because I haven't enjoyed Mesmers any time before, and I've tried various types of them. And this is the first spec that I feel like I've actually really enjoyed playing. And that, for me, that's the mark of a good elite spec. I'm not looking at the balance. I'm not looking at anything like that, but when it takes a profession or class or job or whatever you want to call it in this game and gives it a play style that I feel gives people who didn't like the class a reason to like the class, that is a win. And that's what elite specs should try to do. I think overall, the elite specs for this expansion were perhaps lackluster compared to some of the other ones. But I think it's going to continue to get harder and harder for ArenaNet to add a new elite spec that feels unique and fulfill a different role as there are more and more elite specs that are already there. For instance, you look at the Ranger, Druid was such an obvious different pillar for the Ranger, but it's been done. So that's kind of one way you can't go. So it becomes harder to kind of find a distinct route for each of those. In terms of actual gameplay, big maps and exploration like you'd expect. Obviously, there is the new turtle mount that you can go and collect. A bit of drama with it being tied to kind of a big meta event in the final map, which I did do, and it's quite the event. It's like, set aside an hour and a bit for your for its completion. I luckily did it kind of, I think, after it was kind of nerfed a bit, so I didn't have to deal with a bunch of failures of it. But there's an ongoing battle of, how difficult should content be in the open world? How difficult should content be in Guild Wars 2 in general? I'm not going to weigh in on it. I'm excited to see the challenge modes for the strike missions. I've done a couple of the strike missions on normal mode, and I think they are done super well. I've enjoyed every single fight I've done so far, and I think it's a good continuation. And they talk about, well, we'll start talking about the blog post now. They talk about future strike missions in that blog post about them releasing more and having a challenge mode attached to the future ones as well. I think it's just one more that they talk about for this upcoming kind of Living Worlds content that they're going to be releasing. But I'm very interested in the fact that they are continuing strike missions. One of the other complaints I've had for Guild Wars 2 over the years, apart from its predictability or maybe tied to it, is the fact that they've kind of switched their content styles. They've gone from dungeons to fractals, and now they've kind of stayed with fractals. They've gone from raids to strike missions to, kind of different, like they just keep switching these encounters around, and kind of it feels like they drop the old potato and pick up the new shiny one. I don't know why potato's here, but it's troubling. And I think the fact that they seem locked into the strike missions, it seems like a benefit for them because it takes a piece of content that's developed for the living story or the story that everyone's going to play, and it brings it into a more challenging mode for 10 players, and then they can make an even more challenging mode with the challenge mode on top of that. And because of that, they're able to develop a lot of assets into this. Like it's a piece of content that's going to be part of the story that a lot of people are going to play. So the base rig, the base environment, the base fight is going to be played by everyone. And I think that's the issue they were running in with the raids, where they'd put all this time into it, but a subsection of the entire population would play it. And even a smaller section would then play the challenge modes inside that subsection. By having it be story content first, they can put a ton of assets into the actual design and, graphics of the fight and all that. And then they can just make the challenge portions separate for those subsections. And I think it is a good plan. I've been lukewarm to it at the start. I miss raids because the raids in Guild Wars 2 were one of the best executions of raids I've ever seen. I think that's the main reason I'm having troubles with it, but I do like the strike missions, and I'm excited to see that they're confirming more of them in the future. And this really leads us to the big portion of this entire video, the fact that they are talking about so much of this content well in advance, that they're releasing a kind of roadmap for spring. They've done this a few times now in the past year of these roadmaps, and they're talking about well into the future goals of a 4th expansion. I don't think Guild Wars 2 has ever been in a better place than it has been now. The fact that it's a month after the expansion and they're confirming a 4th one. And a lot of games don't do this because it's kind of expected. Like, for instance, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, they haven't necessarily written that they're working on the next expansion, but you can assume that. Guild Wars 2 was in a place where I honestly made a video earlier this year wondering if this was going to be the last expansion of the game because it's called End of Dragons. It's the end of the cycle. It could have been that. It could have, and rightly so. A lot of people are like, nah, it's not going to be the last expansion, but let's be honest, the content has been less than predictable for Guild Wars 2. For instance, the time between this most recent expansion and Path of Fire was quite long comparatively to the Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire expansion. And it was very much less predictable. We didn't know if we were going to be getting this expansion for a while. And it's just not something that we can expect. And I think until that becomes the case, if it's 3 expansions down the line and we are in a case where, they launch an expansion, they have 2 Living World seasons, and then they launch the next expansion, and they've done that a few times in a row, and Guild Wars still kicking and stuff like that, then at that point, I'm like, okay, we don't need to write about this. They still can, and that's great. But at this point, where it's so unexpected, this is the biggest news they could have. I mean, they could have an announcement that they're going to add a fractal and a strike mission tomorrow. And I think the news of them having the 4th expansion in the works is more important. I just do. I think the consistency and predictability is something that Guild Wars 2 struggled with and have undervalued. And I think the facts that they've made some shifts in upper management, they've made some shifts in terms of game directors and stuff like that, and people who are heavily involved with the franchise, I think is really starting to show that that's paying off in terms of the communication level, as well as the things that they need to communicate to people. Because in that blog post, they talk about the 3 game types as well, like the core pillars of the open world content, the world versus world content, and the SPVP. They talk about them. They don't give a specific path for each of them, but they say, hey, these are important. We've invested technology into these, into the game and the systems to be able to execute these 3 game modes, and that's what we want to do moving forward. So, hats off to ArenaNet, hats off to Guild Wars 2. I've made a lot of videos questioning Guild Wars 2 in the past, and I'm sure I'll continue to make some in the future. But this was the right decision, and this is probably the biggest news you could release and the biggest positive effect you could have on your game. But yeah, that's the video. I don't know. It's a bit rambly. It's kind of a mix of a review and a mix of a blog review, and both of them are kind of like past the date when this news was relevant, but hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the future of Guild Wars 2, and also if you've jumped into the newest expansion. I know a lot of my viewers are Final Fantasy players. I know some of them play other MMOs. If you are a lover of MMOs in general and haven't checked out Guild Wars 2, I would do it. It's worth it. It's so much fun. Definitely an expansion that's worth trying. But yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.